Good evening, everybody. Thanks very much for taking the time to join us for the webinar this evening, which is being hosted by AHDB. I'm Claire McKean. I'm the Knowledge Transfer Officer for Beef and Lamb at AHDB, and I'm delighted to bring you tonight's webinar on red meat export activity and plans for the future. Our presenter this evening is Jonathan Eckley. Jonathan has more than 30 years' experience within the livestock sector and takes the lead on international market development activity across the Asia-Pacific region for AHDB. Jonathan joined our economics department in 2006, where he's grown his expertise across the livestock sectors. And for the last 7 years, Jonathan has focused on supporting British meat exporters to develop their business on global markets. So the plan of action for this evening is that Jonathan will take you through a presentation, and then there will be some time for questions at the end. You will all be muted throughout the webinar, but if anyone would like to ask a question, or at any time throughout the presentation, if you think of a question, then please type it into the box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you can't see this box, you may need to click the orange arrow to open this box up. When Jonathan has finished presenting, I can ask him these questions. So hopefully we won't encounter any technical difficulties tonight, but please bear with us if there are any. And without further delay, I'll hand over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Chloe. So yeah, Jonathan Eckley here. I think we need to drop the 30 years experience out of the introduction for next time, because that really shows my age. But delighted to be here and give you guys a run through some export activity in the red meat sectors at AHDB. I'm going to just give you a quick update on the structure of the team, some aspirations for export, how market access works, look at some of the activity AHDB gets involved with, then update you on a bit of data where we are at the moment, and look at where we're going to next. And I'm sure there'll be some questions that I'll be delighted to try and answer at the end. So the export team, which is based out of the head office in Warwickshire, but has a number of people around the world helping us achieve our aspirations. So we're split into a regional team, and as Chloe said, so I lead on our activity in the Asia Pacific region with a team of two senior export managers, and we're basically covering from India across to Japan and down to Australasia. Not that we do any activity in Australasia, but from India across to Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines, we've had activity. Within that team in Asia, I have two key people that support us in our aspirations. So the first one is a lady called Ray Smith, who's based in the Beijing embassy, who is part of the Department of International Trade structure, but it's a position that AHDB pushed for many years to get an agricultural food and drink counsellor into the all-important Chinese market. It's really important when it comes to market access, that we'll look at later, that we're really well connected politically, and that agriculture and food and drink counsellor really helps us do that. And it also shows the Chinese authorities how serious we are about that market. And then equally as important is my colleague Holly Chen, who helps me with all the activity on the ground in China, whether it be trade shows or missions, and intelligence of telling us what's going on. And then if we look down the middle of the globe, obviously Europe is still critically important to us. So we have a European team that looks after all the activity across Europe, from Portugal across to Eastern Europe. And they're also responsible for any activity we have going on in the Middle East, which is an important region for sheep meat, and further afield down into North and West Africa, which is another market where we have some activity going on that we'll touch on later. And then the third area is North America. Currently, market access limitations means we haven't got great access to North America. Canada is important to us, where we can export both beef, lamb and pork. Currently, we only have access to the USA for pig meat. So I have a colleague, Susanna Morris, who looks after our activity in North America, pushing beef, lamb and pork in Canada, currently just pork in the USA, but also looking at some activity as we hopefully get closer to access for beef and lamb. So why do we export? Export is adding value to the supply chain, and we do it to maximise returns. So we're working in a number of markets, and where there's a premium product where we're trying to get the highest price for. Food service markets in somewhere like Hong Kong is a good example of that. And it's also moving products from the UK that have a very low residual value here, very low demand, and they perhaps attract demand somewhere else and can attract real value back into the supply chain. Carcass balance is a really a good example of that, where it's really important for our sector for a number of reasons, being efficient and sustainable, that we sell 100% of the carcass, and export markets really help us do that because we can get cuts with low residual value here and find a home for them somewhere else. And that's key to that. And of course, key to all of that export work is having access to the markets. So when we look at carcass balance, I think this graph illustrates quite clearly what I mean by that. So in the UK, last year, we slaughtered 10.6 million pigs in round figures. Loins are in real demand in the UK, as are legs. So we consumed loins off 22 million pigs, so there's an import requirement there. But then if you look towards the right of that graph, shoulders and belly cuts, we don't have such good demand for. So we actually have a surplus product that we have little demand for here in the UK. And that's where export comes in to help balance that carcass and maximise the returns. And this is similar across the meat sectors. You know, the UK is certainly described as a leg market. So we have shoulders in surplus, for example, that we can try and find a home for, particularly in Europe where they could have good demand. So a little bit on market access. We obviously want to find markets that have an opportunity for our products. And when we think we've identified those markets, we then need to try and gain access to them, which is a really time-consuming process. Without access to some of the markets, the sectors are simply not at the races. So it's really important we have access to as many markets as we can. So when it comes to exporting products, we have all the opportunities in front of us, which helps us get the maximum value to a market. If we have limited markets, it's very difficult to achieve a higher value for those products. It's a really lengthy process in opening markets. It is a government-to-government responsibility. So when we look at some markets we have access to, and we use China as an example in the region I look after, the agreement for us to export pork and pig meat products to China is a bilateral agreement between the Chinese government and the UK government. It took about 7 years to negotiate that access, from the starting of the process through to completion and shipping, which was gained in 2012 for the pork sector. And it's about agreeing equivalence, so that ensuring that the health, not only human health, but animal health is up to the standards of both countries. Obviously, hygiene standards throughout the supply chain, from farm through to the processor, even to the cold store that products are being shipped out of. When that is agreed, the actual detail of a health certificate will be agreed by both the authorities, and only at that stage can exports start. So after we've identified the target market, and we collaborate with a number of organisations and look at data from around the world to see where we think growth markets are occurring and where we should have access to, the first stage of the process is a questionnaire outlining what controls we have in place. And for example, a recent questionnaire for access for a beef market was a 400-page questionnaire that weighed 7 kilos. So it's not an easy task to start with. Once that has been finalised and the competent authority of the market we're trying to gain access to has received and reviewed that, there will obviously be some outstanding issues which can take some time to clarify. When they're happy that we have equivalence and they're happy with the standards that we have here in the UK, the next stage is to host an inward inspection visit. These visits can be up to 3 weeks long, sometimes they can be sooner, and they will inspect from farm through the process. Obviously the processes, the abattoirs and the cutting plants are key to that, but also through to the cold stores that product will probably be loaded out to go further afield. That will generate a visit report which may have some outstanding queries on it, which again will take some time to resolve, and have some supporting evidence to make sure those are all resolved. And at that point only can the EHC, the Export Health Certificate, which will be the terms and what product can be exported, can be agreed, and only at that point can trade commence. An example would be some inspections from the inspection visit. It may be that the approval is gained very quickly, but it can take as long as 2 years to then get that final EHC agreed. So on to the activity that the export team gets involved with. So trade fairs are an important vehicle for us to promote the products we have in market. So the export team across the globe will attend probably 70 trade events throughout the year. Not all of those are trade shows. Some of those may be where you're trying to engage with some chefs in a market for food service. But there's 3 reasons to go for a trade show. They're really important when you're new to market because they're a really good platform to A, showcase what you have, but find new business. So obviously one of the KPIs for attending a trade show is finding new business. The second reason for going to a trade fair is to maintain existing business in a market that has become reasonably established. So when you've been in the market for a couple of years with product, it's really important that you go and deal with your clients face to face, not consistently, but once a year, to maintain that relationship, to maintain that business. It's a very competitive world out there, and if we're not there or our exporters are not there on an AHDB platform promoting the product and dealing with their customers, somebody else will try and get that business. And the third reason for going is to make sure people are still aware of British produce and the quality of our food we have to offer the global market. Relationships are key. Face-to-face meetings, particularly in the region that I manage, so that's important that we do that. And our trade shows can vary from, we did a show in Singapore which was 18 square meters, and this year all roads lead to a fair which is held in Cologne every 2 years called a Nuga, where we'll have a platform of 320 square meters. We'll have 16 exporters with their dedicated space on that big stand, so they have their own area with their own product that they can meet people and help meet new people and existing people. And some of our smaller stands where we just have a platform where people will come and share a space and have individual meeting tables and catch up with people. But it's important we're there. Interesting that we collaborate with Department of International Trade, so all those trade stands there, where the one on the left is in Germany, the top right is Singapore, and bottom right is in Hong Kong, with some old bloke, me, talking to the ambassador about access aspirations in the Asia region. We collaborate with the DIT team and we brand all our stands under the Food is Great banner, which is a DIT campaign. That clearly identifies us as a British stand with the Union Jack, given as much provenance as it can to signpost people to us. Missions are really important for what we do because they can be very targeted. We run 3 types of mission. So there was 2 inward missions that AHDB get involved with. The first of those would be an inward trade mission, where we bring trade participants, so importers from market and distributors into retail and food service, to come and experience the UK supply chain firsthand. The bottom left picture there is in Essex on a farm where we had some retailers in from Asia, and it really is the opportunity to showcase what we have in terms of our on-farm standards, particularly because that's what we can showcase really well with our beautiful landscapes and first-class husbandry. Through the supply chain, if it's a trade visit, we would engage with a number of exporters and go through the supply chain with them, because that's the important bit, and we're doing it's commercial and it's the business-to-business introductions we can make on that. Examples of that in recent times are some retailers from Hong Kong. This year we've had a number of missions in from the EU, managed by my colleague Remy Fourier, who manages the European market, and that's really great for us because it's proximity to market, so that's easy to do. We've also had 2 missions with trade people from the USA and Mexico, where their markets, Mexico we have no access for, but it's on our hit list, and I'll come to that later. And the USA, where we've had some people in looking at the sheep supply chain, where we're trying to pave the way so when we do get access for those markets, we can hit the ground running and we have some relationships established to hopefully start that trade early. The second type of inward mission we run would be a press or a gourmet journalist visit, and they may come from Europe or further afield, where we're trying to use what we have here, which is a great opportunity to showcase again our farming, our landscape, and our great gourmet food we have to the consumer, and using gourmet journalists, be it for digital platforms or magazines, where we're coming in to get articles written about the wonderful landscape we have, which is generated by livestock. That will include, so we won't take them through the supply chain, we would take them, a typical mission would be do the farm side of it, find a really nice butcher's shop where we could do a bit of cutting, And obviously, it's all important is getting the product in front of them. So take them and make sure they have some really high quality beef, lamb or pork, whichever sector we're looking at, so they can spread that message in their magazines and have maximum reach to consumers in market. So examples there are an inward mission. Obviously, the little piglets went down particularly well. And outward missions, you know, they may go to Europe, or most recently we took a beef and sheep meat mission to Japan. And we also go to some weird and wonderful places. On the right is a market in Ghana, which I took 6 exporters out to a couple of years ago. If anybody's going to that part of the world and would like to try and find my suitcase, I'd really appreciate it. On those outward missions, the really most important part of those, it's a market insight opportunity for exporters to go to a new market and give them an insight tour where we'd work with a local partner, which may be the embassy, to give us a really good induction to doing business in whatever that country is, do some retail consumer visits, and that may be from a wet market through to a high-end retailer, to see what the actual consumer is looking at. And we will be putting product into wet markets as well as retailers in different markets. But the most important one is that business to business meetings. We all know once you've met somebody face to face, it's much easier to do business with them afterwards. So we will work in a market that's new to us to try and identify key importers and key distributors into either the market scene if it's for a commodity product, or those food service businesses supplying restaurants and distributors into high-end restaurants, high-end supermarkets, and then organise what I've just shown you there, which is what I'd like to call a typical speed dating session, where we give each exporter a branded area of a room, and we try and organise in an orderly fashion 15-minute meetings for those guys to have that face-to-face introduction so they can pick up the business later. They can turn into a bit of a car crash, because some people you might want 5 minutes with and some people you might want half an hour with, but we try and manage that flow really well to match up those people with the right people. And when we're in market, the third area is in market development. So highlighting the benefits and the quality of our products, it won't happen by itself. So it's a role we can play working with the supply chain in market. To get products in front of people is kind of key to that. So whether it be some in-store activity where we have access to a market and we can get some product into retailers and actually get people to taste it, because that's key, is getting the quality of that product over, and without the product in front of you, that's very hard to do. And it's raising awareness of the things we have, and you know, the quality, the taste and the provenance of what we've got. And we do that, and that may be with businesses, or say, you know, retailers is a key area to market, particularly in some of those Asian markets I'm dealing with, where we're dealing with high-end retailers. But we have to get the product in there, get people to taste it and have it on the shelf so they can go and buy it. Food service is also key to us on the high-end product we're selling. We have an expensive product, so getting it into high-end restaurants is where we're targeting. So we have to educate the chefs. So we may do some cutting with them with a butchery demonstration, show them some alternative cuts with that high-end product, and then working with a chef to create menus so they can show what they can do with the wonderful product we produce for them. So a lot of our work is in the business-to-business environment. So we're trying to work very closely with our export community here and work with them, with the businesses they're actually dealing with. So that's where the trade show environment comes in, and some of those events we're hosting. But we also need to raise awareness. You know, if we get access to market, we need to tell the consumer we're there. And obviously, you know, the digital channel is increasingly important, particularly when you go to Asia. Many of you will have been to Asia, and the smartphone is king now on apps, whether it be Facebook or WeChat. So we're working on a number of those platforms to work with key influencers to help us spread and reach as many consumers as possible with the messages we have. So now on to see some data. So beef exports in 2018 showed some growth. We exported 110,000 tonnes, which was 5% up on the year. The majority of that, which is probably no surprise, stayed within the EU, and that actually increased last year. So nearly 90% of the product stays within the EU last year. 11% going to the third country. A lot of that is lower value product, but that's really great for the supply chain because it really helps balance that carcass. It's a product that we have low residual demand for, and we've seen really good growth in those offal exports over the last few years. Ireland is obviously the biggest destination. Netherlands was the second largest market last year, followed by France. And then if we look further afield to third country markets, Hong Kong was stable last year, and that's a challenging market this year. We've all seen what's going on in the press there. We've still got activity there, and it's a good market, 8 million residents and 45 million visits to Hong Kong. And two other markets of interest that have grown in importance are the Philippines. We gained access to the Philippines more than a year ago, and we've seen some positive shipments going out there, and even places like Ghana in West Africa where there's some oil wealth and things have been really positive there. Obviously lower volumes, but it's good to see that growth. 2018 was a tough year for our lamb export. Prices were high and it was very difficult trading. So shipments last year fell by 8% to 83,000 tonnes. However, the positive on that is that the fall in value was less marked, so we still exported £365 million worth of lamb. Both EU and third country markets were tough. The EU accounted for 95% of our shipments, with 5% going further afield. Exports to those third countries were tough last year, particularly with some difficult trading conditions in Asia. France obviously is the leading market, accounting last year for about 43% of our exports, which was down on the year. Germany was more positive, which was a further 20% of our exports. And then Belgium is another market, along with Ireland taking product. So of those top markets, 5 of those markets take 90% of the product. The Middle East is an interesting region where we've seen some good growth to places like Dubai in recent years. And we saw growth there to some other markets in that Middle East region, which is good. Tight supplies, high prices elsewhere in the globe. Saw some opportunity there that our exporters were able to fill. 2019 has been more positive. In the first 6 months, data was published last week. We've exported 8% more meat across the 3 proteins, pork, beef and lamb, valued at 711 million. Obviously, currency has been a driver on that, with our weak pound has made us more competitive, and tight supplies in other parts of the globe have helped increase the opportunity. So beef has been up 11% in the first 6 months of the year at 63,000 tonnes, which is encouraging. Ireland is the #1 destination, and our shipments to Ireland have eased slightly this year. The Netherlands is an important destination for us, and we've shipped 8% more beef. France is the 3rd largest market with a 27% increase. And interesting, a lot of the product going to the Netherlands would be processed and then would be re-exported to France. So France is a really important market from the consumer point of view for us to produce that. Further afield, strong growth to the Philippines, lower value product, but getting that access is important. It's getting that money back into the supply chain, and we've seen a near 3-fold increase in shipments going to Manila or the Philippines this year. South Africa has been a good product, lower volume, but good growth there. And interestingly, we've seen some good growth in Canada, in North America, which is positive for us. That market's been open for probably 2 or 3 years now. To see some growth there of higher value product is good. And offal has been a success story, with 20% more shipped this year, and that's actually been driven by increases to other EU member states, including Eastern Europe. Lamb has been encouraging as well, with 23% increase in lamb exports, all driven by the EU. France, Germany and Ireland all being strong this year. Some good growth to the Middle East and Eastern Europe, although Asia has offset some of that. Asia has been quite challenging for sheep meat. And pork is all about China. This year, there's obviously a disease situation on there, so there's been a 9% increase in our pork exports, with the EU actually easing slightly and third countries being higher. So just that map just quickly shows where we have shipped beef to in recent years. So obviously most of that staying in the EU in red there, but Canada has been open. Some good markets there for lower value product, helping us balance the carcass in Africa, and Asia becoming more important, which we'll come to shortly. Sheep meat, a very similar picture, not so much sheep meat going to Africa, and obviously with 95–96% of our export going to Europe, that's been a key destination for us. Some product going to Asia, to Singapore and Hong Kong, and as of this year, there's an opportunity in Japan, which we'll talk about. So that's where that is going. Pork exports. So pork exports surpassed the 300,000 tonne barrier for the first time for a number of years in 2016, and we've seen the processors manage to build on that over recent years and get to nearly 350,000 tonnes. Obviously, China has become a really important market for the pork sector, opened in 2012 and soon became our biggest market in terms of volume and also now our biggest market in terms of value. And in 2018, China accounted for nearly 25% of our pork exports. And obviously, offal is important to that market, but also some quite strong exports and good growth in those processed products as well. Some of those staying closer to home, but good to see that growth adding value to the sector. And that just shows the long-term trend of the increase in pork exports in recent years. And obviously the opening of China has had a big impact on that. So the global coverage for pig meat, there's slightly more areas outside the EU with access to North America and China being the two big markets there, and some products going into India, which is a challenging market. We now have an agreement for sheep meat into India as well. I think the long-term potential there is quite strong, but that is long-term potential. The short-term is very challenging, but the opportunity there with not only the population of India forecast to surpass India very soon, we'll see some opportunity there in the longer term. So a quick look around some of the markets closer to home. So some good growth in the year to date into France. I won't go through the figures because they're on the presentation there that you will get. So some activity going on. In-store marketing is key to the consumer in France to do some animation and some tastings to get them to see the benefits of the products. So July was a strong month for that. August not so many because obviously France goes on holiday and those promotions move to the southern part of the region where a lot of French consumers are on holiday. Some inward missions on the beef side have been really important to showcase what we have there. Germany's been a really strong success story this year with some in-store tasting promotions really helping driving that demand, and we've seen some strong growth there and taking a good 25% share of our market. And interestingly, the German meat team in the World Butchery Challenge have decided to use English lamb, so that's a real good win for us. The Netherlands is an important market, particularly for beef. Second largest market for beef, big processing sector there, and we've seen good growth there. Some good story with some English lamb into big retailers over there, which is really helping drive that growth there on the sheep meat sector. And obviously the currency has helped us. Green Parks, which is a holiday park, a number of big holiday parks in the Netherlands with a real green theme. Choosing English lamb, which is really good on our sustainability messaging and help building on that brand. Some barbecue promotions with retailers and recipes and point of sale promotion in 400 stores recently. Italy, strong growth of both beef and lamb to Italy, which is good. Obviously the currency has helped us there. That can be price sensitive, but good to see that growth. And again, some in-market store, and that's retail promotion with beef and lamb, different cuts to try and help drive that, all using our quality standard mark. So further afield, Japan, we've seen some good growth from lower volumes for pork, seen good growth in 2019, 10% up in the first 6 months of the year. And some of that will be aided by the EU-Japan Free Trade Agreement that came into effect on the 1st of February this year, which has seen the very complicated entry requirement for pork into Japan be slightly easier. Opened up on the 10th of January for beef and lamb. So it's a very challenging market to get established in, but it is a strong market importing a massive amount of beef, 600,000 tonnes of beef. Lamb, not so much, 25,000 tonnes, but there's no tariff on that because they've got nothing to protect, so there's an opportunity there. So we've done 2 bits of activity in Japan, a trade show, and we took 12 exporters out to market to introduce them to some of the key players in the supply chain. And we'll continue to try and develop that market for high value product. China is all about the disease situation they've got with African swine fever, which has seen, I saw a stat this morning, their production is down 32% of pork. So that's left a big hole in their pork demand. It has softened demand, but protein, because of that, has been in demand. So pork shipments have increased in the UK by 12% this year to 77 million, or sorry, 35% this year. They've also, because of that requirement for protein, they've seen strong growth this year from places that have access. So beef shipments in the first 4 months of this year up 54% and a near 20% increase in sheep meat imports. So we've just had an inspection visit this year for beef, which came sooner than we thought, which is really positive. So we do have an agreement to export beef to China, but we're just awaiting plants to be listed, because for China, they have to get individual plant listings. So that process can take some time. And we have a sheep technical inspection, technical fact-finding mission is planned for later in the year, so we can start that journey on sheep access. Trading with China is really, really important. That government relations have to be right, and we talked about the Agri-Food Councillor. Obviously, the products and labelling has got to be 100% correct. It's a very challenging market to get customs clearance. As long as it's right, it goes straight through, but they do pick up any problems. It's really important, if you were going to do business in China and Asia, that we understand the culture, and it's a long-term commitment, and it's about building those relationships with the people in market, and when they trust you, they will do business with you. So just some other markets with some activity. So USA has been a really good market particularly for high value pork. We have a great story to tell on our responsible use of medicines, antibiotic free pork. The discerning customer in the USA likes to have something different. So we've seen strong growth in high value pork there. Hong Kong, we talked about earlier. So there's some activity going on there across the 3 proteins, where we're really engaging with the food service sector. So we're working with some high profile chefs who've got a really good social media following there on the sustainability of our production for beef, lamb, and the high quality pork production we have. A similar story in Singapore. That's a good market with expat population, where we're going into high-end retail and food service with products. The Philippines talked about. That's really is a commodity market, but it's a great market for some products going into that wet market scene. We've taken exporters out there. We've had 2 missions out to the Philippines over the last 4 years to really enhance those connections with the trade. The Middle East is a growth area for lamb, where we do a big trade show in the spring, which is the biggest show in the region, which is a really important show. It's a really important global show now, but it's really important we get our lamb exporters out there and people from around that region come, and we're seeing strong inquiry coming from there. Obviously, price can be an issue, but it's got to keep going at these markets, particularly as Southern Hemisphere products become tighter. And Africa, we're taking, I think 6 exporters are going out to West Africa in September, and that's an offal market, but again, important as those markets develop that we enhance those relationships. Identifying global trends is the next part of my presentation. So where next, really? So it's really important that we keep our eyes open on the ground when we're out in market. The team travel to markets on a regular basis, but we also need to keep an eye on what's happening politically and economically. So there's a number of reports we read, whether it be from the World Bank, Economic Forum, and some specialist meat consultants. And obviously we have quite a close relationship with the embassy network around the world and the Department of Trade. So we keep our ears to the ground to try and find out where the next opportunities lie. We work really closely with my colleagues in market intelligence to help us do that. And we do some consumer insight work, or they do the consumer insight work. So it's really important that we understand what drives the consumer's purchasing choices in market. So there's just some examples there of some recent reports that have been done in some of the key markets we're looking at, being North America and across to Asia, be China and Japan, since we've gained access. And those are all, they're available online from the Horizon reports, and there's a series of those looking at those consumer trends in market that really help our exporters understand what the aspirations are for those consumers, which is what it's about at the end of the day. So where next? So the next markets we're looking at, so China is about getting better access for pork. So we want more pork plants approved, and we're on a journey with that. So hopefully we'll have more pork plants approved in the not too distant future of pork. And obviously beef and sheep meat access to China is really important to us, particularly with the demand that's coming from there at the moment. So beef, we've gained approval to export, so we're just awaiting those plant listings, which can be a frustrating process, but hopefully we'll have some good news on that and be able to start shipping soon. And obviously that will probably be for a small number of plants to start with, but as trust develops, that will enhance. North America, we've had a very recent visit or inspection visit from North America, So that's very recent. So we're just waiting for the outcomes of that report, and we'd hope that will be positive and there won't be too many issues to resolve. And certainly we could start shipping beef at some stage. We'd be optimistic if we said next year, but that's how long it takes. And followed by lamb. Taiwan, we gained access after 12 years of negotiation between the Taiwanese authorities last year. So the next stage for that is to get lamb access, because we think there's some demand there to compete with our Southern Hemisphere counterparts. Vietnam is becoming an important meat market with strong growth there. So there are discussions underway to work on Vietnam as one of our priorities. Mexico imports around 600,000 tons of pig meat, and we have no access to that. 98% of that comes from North America and Canada, and it's no surprise there are a few difficult relationships in that part of the world. So it's an opportunity that if we haven't got access, we can't play that market to try and take advantage of that. Middle East, as I said, strong demand for lamb in the region, so we need to enhance our access and get better access to that. And I touched on India earlier, where we have gained access for lamb last year, but we just need to work on that certificate to make that a bit more workable, and the long-term opportunity there will then be able to be taken advantage of. So that's a quick gallop around the world of some of the regions I work in, some of the regions I don't work in, and a little bit about the market access process and where we're going next. So that concludes my formal presentation. So it's time for questions.
Thanks very much. So while I'm waiting for some questions to come in, I'd just like to remind everyone that the presentation has been recorded, so it will be available on the YouTube channels in the next day or so. I'd also like to highlight that we have UK Cattle and Sheep Yearbooks and the UK Pig Facts and Figures book. So these are pocket guides, and they include information on livestock numbers, slaughterings, production, meat prices, and imports and exports, to name a few. And these are available on the AHDB website. So the first question is, once the UK gains market access to another country, are all the plants eligible to export?
There's two answers to that. That in most cases, what happens is an authority will come to the UK and they'll do what's called a systems audit. So they will go from farms and into the plants, the abattoirs, and they'll take a selection of abattoirs, and they're actually auditing the systems, which is very hard if you're an abattoir owner, for a bunch of inspectors to come in to try and be clear that they're not actually auditing that actual abattoir, they're just auditing the systems in place, like the control systems. Every health cert to a third country has the chief vet, Christine Middlemas's signature on it. So what those authorities are doing are ensuring that that signature is 110% correct with the systems in place in the abattoir. Most countries, when you pass that and all the queries are resolved, will then they will either list all licensed plants, or there will just be a bureaucratic process to get on the list. But generally, if you're a licensed plant, you will be approved for someone like Singapore when they give approval. China is the other extreme, that to date, they have done all of that and given the systems, so they like the systems, but then they will send inspectors to inspect the individual plants. And that's what takes the time, because obviously everybody has a limited resource. There's many countries around the world who want access to China and on that process, and they only have a limited number of inspectors who can go out and do this. So that's from one extreme where that's the hardest, is the China example. And there's one in the middle where, you'll pass the systems audit, and then there'll be an internal food standards agency audit to just audit your plant against the standards. For Japan is an example of that, where there's a set of standards. So they've given the go ahead to the UK. So then they will entrust the competent authority, and in our case, the Food Standards Agency, to do the audit against their standards.
Thank you. And given the extent of African swine fever in China, who are our main international competitors in filling this void?
Okay, so Europe per se is the biggest supplier of pig meat, and then the USA would be the second biggest. The UK is the 9th biggest supplier of pig meat into China. So the big competitors in Europe are obviously Denmark is the biggest export, the Netherlands, Germany, France, and then the USA has been fiercely competitive, but there's a very interesting tariff situation going on between China and America. So the standard tariff for going into China for pig meat is around 10.5%. In June last year, China put an additional 25% onto US pork, and in September they put another 25% on. So there's something like a 61% tariff going in, which has seen America be a bit more challenged in that, particularly for commodity product. And then, Brazil is somewhere on the scene now with some cheap products, so they're very price competitive. So it's still a very competitive space. The UK has held its own there. 2016 was an amazing year for pork into China because demand was sky high. 2017 was much more challenging, but the UK actually shipped 1% more pork in 2017. And we thought that was a challenging year. And then the first half of 2018 was even more challenging. But then with the tariff situation with the US and then African swine fever emerging in June last year, we saw an uplift in shipments last year. The downside, I guess, has been it has had a negative impact on pork production in China, so that's softened some of the increase. So certainly more volume has gone to China, but the rise in prices has been much more measured than it was when demand was furious in 2016.
Thank you. Japan has recently opened its doors. What is the scale of the opportunity? Do we have a target amount of tons that we could get over there?
Yes, so I haven't got that figure to hand. It's 53 million is the figure in sterling. So, I mean, the opportunity is great, particularly if we look at what they import. So until China opened its doors a little bit, Japan has been one of the biggest protein importers on the planet. So they take in an awful lot of beef, and they take in an awful lot of pig meat. So on the beef side, the scale of the opportunity, there is definitely an opportunity there. There are some challenges that come with that obviously the premium product in Japan is a grain-fed product, Wagyu, that we're all familiar with. So grass-fed beef is not really on the agenda. So there's a lot of work there to push that message. And obviously Australia and America, who've had access for a number of years, have been really pushing the grain-fed message. So there's some challenges there, but the size of that opportunity has to be there because of the consumption. It doesn't come with the challenges, and for certain products, it's the best market in the world. So it's great that we've got access for it. It's the best market in the world for beef tongues, which really help add a little bit of value back into our supply chain. For pig meat, again, it's a big opportunity, but again, it has been challenging. But the EU FTA that we currently sit in helps us with the access for that. So we've seen some good growth there for some different products. And sheep meat, yeah, there's definitely an opportunity there. We were out there in March with the first consignment of sheep meat at a meat seminar at the embassy, and actually the lamb went down really well because they perceived it as a healthy product. They only import, and it's been really static over the last 3 years, 25,000 tons. So there's definitely an opportunity to get some out there and hopefully some high value product. But the scale of that, 25,000 tons, compared to we exported 45,000 tons to France. We just have to be realistic on that, but definitely there is an opportunity.
Thank you. Looking at the Middle East sheep market, the live movement from Australia is obviously very important. There is a very strong lobby in Australia to stop this. If this succeeds, will it benefit our exports?
I think if they did halt live exports, I suspect they would try and switch that trade into a carcass trade or a cut trade, particularly the cut trade where they add value. There certainly is an opportunity out there particularly for halal lamb, and our proximity to market and the quality of our product does give us an opportunity there. And I think that's reflected in the growth in sales we've seen over the certainly last year to some of those markets and the inquiries we're getting from there. And obviously Southern Hemisphere supplies are looking tight, particularly Australian drought-driven, climate-driven. So that does give us an opportunity to try and explore some of those markets. We're actually doing some market research in the Middle East as we speak to look at the opportunity. Dubai's been a reasonable market for some high value product that's air freighted in there from the UK. So we're currently just commissioned or have commissioned, and it's underway, some market research on that region to try and look at what the opportunity is on an evidence base. Okay.
Thank you. And how hard do you think it will be for the US to regain market share in China post tariffs?
I think they, being such a big exporter, they have some scale, and they are still well established over there. And I think there's two parts to the market that they're looking at, or they look at. The part they haven't really lost market share is some of the high-end stuff they're doing, where some of their big exporters have contracts with some very well-known retailers out there. So that part of the trade, and because some of those wealthy Chinese consumers, they're not too worried about it, they can take a little bit of a price increase. The commodity market, it will be tougher, but again, it can be very price sensitive. If they can produce their product cheap enough, I expect they will establish market share. Not quickly, because it takes time. It does take time, particularly to maintain those relationships. But with some big export companies and being such a big supplier of pork on the global stage, particularly with the shortage that is there, if it was resolved, they would crack it, not overnight, but they would work at it because of the value of the market.
Thank you. And what should exporters be doing to prepare for Brexit?
Brexit, that's a challenge because I don't know the answer to where we're going to land. Obviously, what we're doing is we're exploring these third country markets, and it's important that the exporters look at as many options as they can outside Europe. If we did come out with a hard no deal Brexit, which is looking more likely, there is it's not in question that the tariff into the EU will increase, because at the moment we're tariff free. So that will be a challenge. So it's looking at some of those other markets that we've currently got access to, looking at opportunities elsewhere to work with both AHDB on a technical front and government to establish other markets, and obviously being up to speed with export protocols in terms of the paperwork. So currently, we export 95% of our lamb to Europe and 89% of our beef, and there's no health certification that goes with that. Most exporters, most big exporters, will be familiar with that because they will be doing third country trade, be it to Canada, the Middle East, or China in the case of the pork market. But it's just being sure that you're 100% have 100% understanding of how that export health certificate works, and how you make sure that's 110% right, because that's what it has to be.
Thanks. And the market access that we talk about, is that as an EU member state, and what work is going on to ensure that these markets will still be accessible after Brexit at good trade tariffs?
Yep. The market access per se is nearly all, and when I say nearly all, there's only one market I can think of that we have access on an EU-wide basis. So all the agreements we have with third country markets, be it China for pork, North America for pork, the Philippines for beef, Hong Kong for beef, Singapore for lamb, for example, they are all bilateral agreements between the UK government and the Taiwanese government authorities, or the American government in the terms of pork. So they're bilateral agreements. So they're not affected by the EU. Now, there may be some questions on that, because we will have to have a new health mark, which is in hand. So the access per se should not be restricted because of that. What could be restricted is if there's any EU-wide free trade agreements. And I've mentioned it quite a few times tonight because it's quite new, is the EU-Japan FTA, for example, which took 7 years to negotiate. If we come out with a hard Brexit, some of those FTAs, we would be outside of those, so we may not be on such a competitive tariff rate, which could be challenging. Now, there will be some agreements made where there's some contingency and there is a transition period, and we may be able to still use the same rate as some of those FTAs, but that'll be on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. And if we have a no-deal Brexit, will it affect our current exporting massively?
It will certainly cause us some challenges in the short to medium term. I don't know what that's going to look like as of today. I wish I did, because it's certainly causing plenty of uncertainty for our exporters, and the closer we get to it will become some uncertainty and some buying patterns as well, I suspect. So if we were to face, a high tariff on sheep meat that is talked about, that will certainly cause us some challenges. If there was a 40% tariff, I'm sure the French consumer would struggle to pay an additional 40%. So that's going to come from somewhere. And we don't know, there may be some disruption in the supply chains, and that disruption can have some knock-on effects that it can be hard to re-establish those if that goes on for a long time.
Thank you. Is the US beef and lamb market as significant as it's generally imagined? So this person said they're thinking that modest levels of Irish beef have been imported into the US since 2015.
Yeah, I think, it's a big market for sure. For us, it's a market that if we can get access for both round cuts and manufacturing beef, now it's not going to take containers and containers of product to start with, but the pork market's a really good example of that, where we've got a differential product, and we've seen really strong growth of high welfare, outdoor bred, antibiotic-free pork, where the discerning consumer is prepared to pay that. And we've seen good year-on-year growth over the last 2 years on that. And I think we can have some similar aspirations on both beef and lamb. They import a lot of lamb from the Southern Hemisphere. Their domestic production, they don't produce, they're not self-sufficient. So I think there's an opportunity there for some of our high quality products. And again, I think beef, on a similar thing to pork, if we can get some really good quality product into the top end of that, there's an opportunity there for some expensive product. And also, manufacturing beef. And I think, Ireland, I'm not sure top of my head what's on the Irish cert. And of course, it can always be, when a country gets market access, what the state of that market is at the time. So it's important to have that so we can have a crack at that opportunity.
Thanks. Are there any particular carcass specifications the Chinese market are looking for?
I think they will be looking for a big market for a variety of cuts. When the cert for beef comes through, it will be a boneless beef under 13 month specification on the export health certificate, as I understand it. So in terms of carcass, we have to produce, because we're not going to be selling whole carcasses to China. So what it's going to be about is taking some of those cuts that have low value here that can attract a value over there. Some of those will be high value cuts because there's a real opportunity into the niche market restaurant sector. And of course, you don't need much of a niche market of 1.2 billion people. So I think, we're not going to be looking at carcass specification for a particular market like China, because it's unrealistic to be thinking of exporting carcasses there, because we need to disassemble that carcass to sell each cut to the market that attracts the highest value, much of which is here in the UK. So export is there to complement the home market.
Thank you. And could you see the need for us to prove we are free of African swine fever in the future to keep certain markets?
I think it's a watching brief on that for me. It's a concern for the sector globally, and some markets may come to that. I don't think many will in the short term, but it's something we need to keep an eye on.
Thank you. And somebody's asked about the current domestic red meat consumption. Do we know if that's having an effect on exports abroad? Is that something that we monitor?
Just clarify, so when they ask about, red meat production consumption is under pressure in the Western world. Are they asking if that's similar in some export markets, or?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Okay, so if that's the question, yes and no. So in some markets, definitely under pressure here. You hear in some of the developed markets, Hong Kong is a market where, talking to some of my counterparts from other exporting nations, you hear talk of that, although not so much evidence to it, but certainly some noise made about it. Whereas in many other of those developing markets, China being a case in example, Vietnam, some of those Asian markets, as incomes have grown over the years and people have moved to a more urban society, their desire for a Western meat-based diet has increased. So we're certainly projecting growth to come out of particularly the Asia region, where there's, the increase in the middle class over the next 20 years is where the income growth is going to be, and that will drive demand for products as more people want it on their plates.
Thank you. And the very last question, how long is the process to receive approval from China for pig meat exports from a currently unlicensed UK processing plant?
How long is a piece of string, I guess? So it's a really difficult one to answer. The first thing is they have to be, for pig meat, they have to be a single species plant. So there's been a number of plants killing multi-species that won't get approved, certainly in the current regime. It could be quite quickly if their demand is there, but it can take years. It can take, if we bear in mind, we've got first approvals for China. I think the first approvals for exporting pork to China were made at the end of 2011, with shipments starting in 2012. The next broadening of approval to get the additional plants approved in Northern Ireland as part of the UK cert, because they won't move on, happened in 2017. So that gives you an idea. And I'm not saying it would take 5 years, but it's not an overnight process.
Thanks very much. Well, we've come to the end of the questions.
Just let me add to that, Claire, just to clarify, because that will start with a questionnaire process, which takes time, and then there will be an inspection process when anything's resolved on the questionnaire. That may bring some issues up that need resolving. So it's not a quick process.
Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that one.
The prize may be worth having.
Right, well, thank you very much. Thanks for a brilliant presentation, and thank you to everybody at home for listening, and some great questions tonight as well. I'd like to remind everyone that the presentation has been recorded, so it will be available on the AHDB YouTube channels, along with our other previous webinars. So thanks again, and have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.